All right. We'll go ahead and get started. Jim, would you lead us in a word of prayer? Amen. All right, we're in 2 Corinthians. I think, if I remember right, we were close to the end of chapter 4, maybe into chapter 5. So it's 3. We've been in 4, I know for sure. Yeah, you'll have to stay awake for this one next time. So we know. Yeah. Okay, so let me, if we're doing that, sorry, I've got to take my glasses off to be able to see here. There we go. Okay. Had to call up the chapter 4. I know we had talked about chapter 4 through 7 through 12. We talked about the jars of clay. I know we had talked about 13 through 15, or at least we had started to. So let's get to verse 16, and then that will lead us then again into chapter 5. Paul has been talking about here, again, the answering of questions about their ministry, why they were doing what they were doing, their motivations, all of those challenges that came with it, and he's begun to answer some of those things and go through them. He's talked in verse 7 about them being jars of clay. In other words, it was the message and not the messenger that was the most important thing, and yet even though here they are, these fragile things, carrying this important message, we find that they had not been broken. And so God had taken care of them, yet they were ready to give their lives if that was necessary for the sake of the gospel. But the way that they were living their lives there in verse 11 and 12 was for the benefit of the people. Verse 13, he begins to quote, and he says, I believe, so I spoke. And again, the idea being there is the natural manifestation of why they would do what they would do. Faith compels us to speak to others. It compels us to share that story. And again, excitement and love and all of those things also do the same thing. Whether it's something that's good that happens in our lives or something that we're excited about, we want to share it with other people. Why not that much more with the gospel that shares souls? And so he says in verse 15, so it's for your sake. And so this grace extends more and more people may increase with thanksgiving to the glory of God. And again, we talked about his motivations behind why he preached in that particular section. I think that's where we left. And so he had, we had mentioned the first one is because Paul believed. Reason number 2 is that the death would not rob him of his crown. Reason number 3 is it helps others. And reason number 4, it helps to save souls. And then we might add into that reason number 5 because it gives God glory. Okay, so with all of those things, if we look at all of those reasonings and we come to that conclusion that here they are preaching the gospel, God has cared for them along the way. Even though they have had difficulties, they still remain strong. They believed their message. It was helping other people. It was saving souls. What do they get there for in verse 16? They say, so we don't lose heart. In other words, this is Paul saying, well, because of all this, that's why we keep going. That's why we haven't given up. That's why we haven't lost our excitement, our emotion, our zeal. When you consider all this, we haven't lost heart. He says, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. And again, universal truth I think we all recognize. Every day we get up, we're a day older, right? I was just talking to Richard this morning out in the deal. Yesterday, after walking around doing everything down in the square, I was at the house and I took a step back and my left knee locked up on me, and it's been hurting ever since then. And so that's just part of getting old, is that things like that happen. And, you know, as you've probably heard someone mention before, you know you're getting old when you can sleep wrong and you get up sore the next morning, you know. That's a phenomenon that you don't have when you're 18 or 19. You can sleep anywhere in any position and it's fine. You get up and you're not sore. I get the wrong pillow. The next day I get up, my neck's sore, you know. Our bodies are every day getting older. And then you add to it things that take place that accelerate that process, whether it's an injury or something of that nature. And so our outer self is wasting away. And Paul makes that statement, and we recognize that to be true. But Paul says, in spite of that, in spite of the fact that the outside is being beaten and abused and all those kinds of things and getting older, and the inside every day is getting stronger. It's being refreshed. And so again, Paul reminds us here that age is not something that we should use as an excuse. You know, Paul says, listen, even though the outside may be in rough shape, the inside every day is getting stronger. And that, I think that should be our goal as Christians, is that each and every day to be renewed in our service to God, in our love of God, in our faith, in our walk of faith, and to have that sort of attitude that Paul seems to display here. And then he goes on to explain even farther. He says in verse 17, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not at the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are seen are eternal. So, even though this life is taking its toll on our body, and we're spiritually getting stronger, he also recognizes that what the body is going through is temporary, right? And so you look at it, he says, the light, momentary affliction. Remember Paul's life? Remember what Paul went through? He is stoned and almost left for dead. And again, if you've ever really considered what it meant to be stoned, it was a brutal, brutal thing. And so to endure that, Paul goes through it and is continuing. I mean, I'll be honest with you, to go through that kind of pain, that kind of abuse, and be to the point of death, as they thought Paul was, that might motivate many of us to just go, okay, well, maybe we need to calm down here a second. Maybe we need to find some more friendlier confines where we can give our message where they're not going to be throwing large rocks at us as we're down in a hole. And so Paul goes through all that, and he's endured other things, and by his own admission, he says, all the physical things, I also have the care for the churches. There was an emotional weight that he carried around. And so Paul, in all of this, he's carrying this weight, he's feeling this affliction, but he says it is light and it is momentary. It's just for a brief time. And when you compare it to the eternal weight of glory, there is no comparison. And so Paul, in all of this, downplays whatever difficulty he's going through, and in contrast to that, he says, God offers much more. And so, again, we might say, consider and I hate to use this word, but the investment or the cost of something. If I said, listen, I'm going to need you to, for the next 2 months, give me 3/4 of your paycheck. And after that, I'm going to give you $10 million. It'd be hard, wouldn't it? Go through those 3 months. But you'd say, well, at the end of it, for some of us, that would be more than 3 months' salary. I don't know. But, you would say to it, okay, whatever price I have to pay, even though it might be tough, it might not be pleasant, it's temporary, and compared to what I'm going to receive from it, it's nothing. I'm willing to make that sacrifice. And so that's basically what Paul's saying here is, listen, what we're going through, it's okay because it's momentarily, it's light, and it doesn't compare to what we gain from living these lives of faith and preaching the gospel the way that they were. And so he says in verse 18, we don't look at the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, and the things that are unseen are eternal. And again, Paul likes his contrast. He likes to offer two sides to look at something. And so he's talking about that which is seen versus that which is unseen, and that which is transient and that which is eternal. And he's talking about a matter of perspective. And so maybe we've explained it like this before. I don't remember, but your perspective changes the way you handle something, right? If we have an eternal perspective, then time all of a sudden is viewed differently. For example, take this. When a baby cries because they're hungry, it's because it's literally the worst thing that's ever happened in their short life, right? I mean, we think about that and they go, well, why are they crying so much? It's literally the worst thing that's happened. Okay? For us as adults, we have a longer view of things. If I miss lunch, do I get grumpy? Sure. But I recognize in the past things have happened, and I've had to do that, and I know that there's other opportunities. And so it's although it's not ideal, we can look at it as adults and go, okay, well, with the perspective of larger information and all that, we can make it through this, right? If we think that our lifetime, our entire existence is 80 to 90 years or whatever it is, 40 years of suffering and labor that's a lot, isn't it? That's half or almost half of your entire life. But if you think in terms of eternity, 40 years is nothing. It's a blip. It's not even worth registering, right? And so when we have that gained perspective, time then shifts in the way that we view time. And that's what Paul's saying. Listen, this is momentary. Whatever we're going through, whatever abuse, whatever pain, whatever hardship or turmoil, it's temporary. And we think about the eternal things. And because of eternity, we know we can make it through this. We know there's so much more. And so again, when you look at Paul and the statements he makes, it begins to show us why he is the way that he is. And we often marvel at Paul, and we look at Paul as this great example, as a great evangelist, which he was. And at the same time, we also see that his motivations are not different than ours. The same things that motivated Paul are available to us. We tend to think about the apostles and all of them as far as having miracles and being able to do these miraculous things and seeing Jesus and walk with Jesus, and those are all great things. But when you really get down to it, what motivated them are the same motivations that we have available to us. And Paul is displaying that for us. And so it reminds us, as we look at Paul's example, that life is temporary in its difficulties, and the promise of heaven is eternal. And it does motivate us not only to work towards it and to labor as we head in that direction through the blood of Christ, but also to help those along the way to go with us. Okay, anybody got anything they want to say before we get to chapter 5? Y'all are going to be quiet today. All right, fair enough. Well, let's do this then. Somebody read for me chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. I'll get somebody to talk.
For we know that in our earthly house, this tent is destroyed. We have a building from God, God's house, not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven. And if indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. For we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further
Yes, through 5.
Now he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who also has given us the Spirit as a guarantee.
Okay. So, in chapter 5 here, he is continuing his statement, and he's going to use a different metaphor, so to speak, or at least a word image of some kind. He said, "For we know that the tent of our earthly home is destroyed. We have a building from God, a house not made with hands." And so, again, it comes out in the English. It's very clear in the Greek. He's talking about two different kinds of living arrangements. Number one is a tent, which for most of us, would be a temporary dwelling at best, right? There are some people who enjoy being in tents, and maybe for them, they like to stay out there longer than others. But for most people, I think we would recognize the tent is probably not ideal for the long term, right? And so he says, this tent, our earthly home is destroyed. We have a building from God, a house not made with hands. The word there, house, is what we would call a more permanent dwelling. And so again, the tent that he's talking about is what? Somebody help me out here. Okay, our physical bodies. And so talking about our physical bodies, he says, listen, this temporary dwelling, so to speak. And again, I think it gets back to a perspective that should be important to us, where we recognize that as people, we have a duality. There is a corporeal and a fleshly part of us, a tent, as Paul calls it here, and then there is the eternal part of us, the soul, the part that's going to live on. And so Paul, in displaying these, give me just a second, I saw you. In displaying these, he contrasts them and says, listen, one is temporary, one is more important, one is more solid. And so the question then becomes, how do we as Christians view ourselves? Do we view ourselves as bodies that have a soul, or souls that happen to be in bodies right now? Because, again, that is a very different way of looking at it, isn't it? If we are bodies that have souls, then our first desires should be to, and what's important to us should be to fulfill that bodily part of us. If we see ourselves as souls who happen to be in a body at this particular point, we begin to think more spiritually and we begin to think more eternally. Yes, sir. Go ahead. That's a good question. You asked lots of good questions. I'd have to look at the Greek and see if you're talking about, is he making the connection here, or is, that's a good question. I don't know, I'd have to look and see. But I think you can make that. I think you can certainly make that parallel when you're looking at it, the idea of the tabernacle, as spectacular as it was, and it's probably pretty spectacular as far as tents go. It didn't compare to the glory of the temple, Solomon's temple, and so the idea being here is, it's certainly one that they would have been familiar with, the tabernacle and its temporariness as opposed to the permanency in their eyes of the temple itself proper. All right, anybody got anything else? It's a good question. Yeah. Does it say? Okay, all right. Okay, all right. Yes, ma'am? Did you?
I was reading Ephesians 2, verse 3, where it says, it's talking about they were sons of disobedience. Among them we too all formerly lived in the lust of our flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. He suggests you're still a child as a Christian if you are more interested in your body than your soul, is the way I take that.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean,
Right.
again, you look at a child, what are their major concerns? Do I got enough Cheerios? Is Paw Patrol on? All those kinds of things. They just want to fulfill that immediate need, where hopefully as adults we're probably thinking about things that are a little, which direction is the family going, my career, all the, bigger issues that need to be solved and things like that. What kind of children am I going to raise and all that? There's a deeper line of thought there, and certainly that would line up with what Paul is saying here, is that they thought spiritually. They thought with those bigger themes into the downplaying of what was going on around them, where children don't do that. They can't do that. That's their whole world and their whole existence.
Well, they had a more severe lesson in being dedicated to the Lord and what He stood for and maybe spiritual things than perhaps maybe we did, because when they became Christians, some of them lost their jobs.
Yeah.
And they were, no one is following us around to stone us or to kill us because we're a Christian.
Right.
So, it was, I don't know if you would consider it a blessing or not, but they definitely had to make a decision. There was no fence sitting here.
Right. Right.
You either did it and were a Christian and took whatever come down the pipe because of that,
Right.
or you decided to go another direction.
Right. I always thought about that. Like there's certain people who want to be called evangelists and things of that nature. And I wonder if some of them are going to get to heaven, some of us are going to get to heaven, and Paul goes, "Oh, you're an evangelist? Tell me about your evangelism." And we're like, "Oh, it was tough. Like, a couple of days, traffic was heavy, and there was a long line at Starbucks, and we were trying to get to, that kind of thing." And he's just sitting there waiting, going, "Okay, when did they start throwing rocks at you? When did they, like, I'm waiting for that part of the story," and then, it doesn't come. And you're right, they went through a whole lot compared to kind of what we go through. You were going to say something? Did you raise your hand? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. 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 And so exactly, he's continuing that thought, and it's very easy to see that continuation. And he says, "Listen, in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling." Again, I think you look at it, and maybe what he's saying here is, we tend to think our tents are groaning because they're hurting. Paul's tent's groaning because it's longing to be in its heavenly dwelling, right? And so I think about this example, and my wife I don't go shopping with her anymore for clothes because I like to go in, get it, get out, let's get on with our lives. Melissa's not. She takes a more slower approach, more thorough approach, maybe we'll say, to choosing her clothes and things of that nature. There is something about those moments. The small of my back goes numb, and it's like, anytime. And so I don't go anymore. But that's almost what Paul is saying here. Is like, he's like, here we are in these earthly, and we're like, oh, can we just get on with it? Can we get to where we want to be? Can we finally get out of this and get on to heaven and be with the Lord? And because he himself has that attitude, it's better for me to be with the Lord than it is to be here. And he says, our tent groans. We're longing to be in our heavenly dwelling. And so he sees that as the better thing. And so we might think of it as Paul saying our tent groans. He's complaining, oh, my back hurts, my knee hurts. My leg. That's not what he's groaning about. What he's groaning about is I don't want to be here. There's someplace else I'd rather be. And so as he's going through it, and he says in verse 3, if indeed by putting it on we may be found naked, for while we're still in this tent we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He has prepared this very thing, is God, and has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. And so again, Paul's saying, listen, we are striving not because we just want to put off this groaning, moaning existence. That's not the whole goal of this. It's that we're looking for something that's better. Yeah. Yeah.
Oftentimes, I say, well, I hope so. But Paul doesn't say, I hope so. Paul says, we know that we have a better over the hill
Right.
instead of, well, I hope so.
Right. Right.
And I think that's important to recognize. He says, we know. He had every confidence that
Right.
going on is going to be better.
Yeah, that's a good point, because a lack of confidence causes us to pause when we're not sure of what's ahead or what's in front of. So again, just thinking of examples off the fly here, walking through a dark room where you can't see is a very different gait in our step than it is when it's lighted and we know what's ahead of us, right? We are less cautious when the lights are on because we can see what's in front of us, so we have that confidence. And yeah, you're right. Paul's saying we know this, and therefore that gives him that confidence to live his life in this way, knowing what lies ahead of him or where he is on this journey and where it goes. So that's good. Okay. Verse 6, he says, we are always of good courage. We know that while we're at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, but we are walked by faith but not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage. Why isn't my... There we go. Our aim is to please him, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each may receive what is due for him. So that each may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. Okay, so again, sort of reiterating what we've said here, Paul says we're of good courage. We know it's better to be with the Lord. We look forward to that. So it doesn't matter whether we're on our way or we're there. Our aim is to please him. He finishes in verse 9 here. And so the idea Paul says here is, listen, it doesn't matter if we're in this body, this tabernacle, or if we're going on the bigger and better things. Our aim is to please God, and so that's what we're going to do no matter what. And then he reiterates, and I think in verse 10, he gives sort of another bit of motivation, and that is we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Why is it that they would labor in the body? Why would they press this earthly tabernacle in ways that were uncomfortable? And even though they gave God glory, it wasn't always the most wonderful thing or most exciting thing for them to have to endure. And I think verse 10, he answers that question. The reason why they're willing to go through that is because they know they have to appear before the judgment seat of Christ. And again, getting back to that idea, at some point we're going to give an account for what we've done, whether good or whether it's bad. And that should motivate us to make sure that we're living our lives in such a way to hear those words, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think a paramount reason why Paul did all this, because he loved the Lord.
No.
I mean, beyond comparison almost. He loved the Lord is the reason why he did all that. Yes, we will be judged, all of us. But his motivation was because he loved Christ and he yearned to be with Christ because he loved him and everything he stood for, everything he'd done for him, and him being king of the universe. I mean, all of it, he loved God. Like, he was practicing the great commandment. Love
Right.
the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength.
Right. And he makes the point in this. He talks about judgment, and I think when we think judgment, sometimes we think bad things, right? We're judging bad things, because after all, in our court system, if you're coming before a judge, someone's accused you of doing something bad. And so you're either giving a defense, no, I didn't do that bad thing, or they're proving, yes, you did that bad thing. And it's about bad things. But what does he say here? We're going to be judged for the things that we've done, both good and evil. And so to add on to what you're saying, again, we've used it a lot here, but think of a child. when they do something. Maybe they've done some project at school, or they've drawn a picture or something like that. What do? They bring it to mom and dad and they show it to them. And they're proud of it, right? Listen, I want to share this with you. I'm trying to make you happy by showing you this thing. And so, again, judgment for us as Christians, that's how we should look at it. It is our opportunity to show our Heavenly Father that we love. Listen, these are all the ways I tried to give you glory. And these are the ways that I tried to obey you and make you happy and build that relationship with you. And again, instead of thinking of it as we're going to go before God and I hope he doesn't, throw me into hell and all the bad things. And we shouldn't live as Christians simply not to do wrong. We should live as Christians motivated by our love for God to do that which is good, so that on the day of judgment we have that to display before Him. And it's not what we normally think of when we use that word judgment. All right, anybody got anything else they want to add to it? Yes, ma'am.
To me, it's just really an encouraging scriptures, because he's standing before them and he's saying, be of good courage. Come on, y'all, let's do it. Let's go.
Right.
God has given us this promise that even though we're going through all these things, and more than Paul was persecuted, a lot of people were persecuted. And so he's saying, don't give up. Be of good courage. We're of good courage. So we're all standing together, helping each other. And God has promised this, so let's keep going. Let's do it.
Right. Yeah, and I think there would be some who would look at Paul and go, look at all the trouble he's in, and look at all the things, this is, and Paul is like you're saying, he's telling them, no, we're living the dream here. Like, we're doing good things, and we're serving God, and you guys can do that too. And you're right, it is very positive in the way that he's approaching it. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Right. 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 Well, it's because of one that we have the other. You know what I'm saying? And I guess I'm trying to follow your line of thought here, is that because of the blood of Christ, as Christians, those of us who have access to it through the grace of God by obeying the gospel, that means we approach judgment in a different fashion. Does that make sense? And so again, I think that's, and what Paul got to previously, where he's talking about the saving of men's souls and the reconciliation that he's going to mention in all of this. And so, I think that would be sort of the connection between the two. Yes, ma'am.
Well, the world considered Paul a troublemaker.
Yeah.
He was just really a rebel and a troublemaker, and people wouldn't have anything to do with him because of that.
Right.
And but he didn't care what the world thought. He did what the Lord told him to, and commissioned him to do.
Right.
And sometimes we forget to stand up for the gospel. People are not going to like it.
Right. Well, and again, you're talking about that difference in perspective. When one has an eternal perspective and the other has an earthly perspective, what's important to them is going to clash, and sometimes in major ways. And so, yeah, when you have those who cannot see past the earthly existence, and they're dealing with those who see past the earthly existence into the eternal existence, they're going to hit heads. It's going to be, and certainly so Paul would be that way. And again, I think us too. Looking at our lives, I don't think the world should be comfortable with us, right? Like, we spend a lot of time as Christians dealing with the world, and I think unfortunately the way some of us deal with it is to blend in with the world. And that's a challenge. We have to live in the world, but we shouldn't be of the world. And so, again, I guess the last example I'll go with here is, because we're about time. We went to Philadelphia one time. And me being who I am, of course, I wore Dallas Cowboy stuff in Philadelphia. And I heard about it too. Like there was people who made comments and things, and I chirped back with them. And like I had a fun conversation with a guy that drove our buggy that took the tour of Philadelphia and all that. And, as a Cowboy fan, I didn't want to be among Philadelphia Eagle fans and then be comfortable with me, right? I wanted to let them know I'm not like you people. I've got standards in class and all. You know what I mean? I don't throw snowballs at Santa Claus and all that kind of stuff. Like I'm not an Eagles fan. And I think as Christians we have to have that attitude. That it should be our desire to have a clear line of demarcation between us and the world. Listen, we have eternal principles. We have an eternal perspective. There are things that are more important to us than what's right here, right now. And so because of that, I want you guys to know that we're different, right? And Paul certainly did that. And should motivate us to, in many ways, to be the same way, to stand out in the world because of this different perspective. Okay, we'll let it go with that. We'll get into verse 11 next week, and then move into, or no, we still got plenty of time in chapter 5. So we'll try to finish up chapter 5 next week. We'll just put it at that. Thank you for everybody for your comments.